I think the Cold War provides an important context for what I wrote about in this book with these artists and engineers collaborating together. I think if we pull back a little bit and maybe don't think specifically about particular technologies, but we think about the larger context of what was happening, I think certainly, at least in the United States, you had lots of large companies like AT&T and IBM that, because of the Cold War, because of their activities, oftentimes defense related, these were companies that were financially doing very well. So in the 1960s, because these companies were so prosperous, and they also were oftentimes very paternalistic, so they had compared with today, a much stronger sense of civic duty. So there was sort of the inclination, but also the financial freedom to make these investments and to help support these programs that brought artists and engineers together. And I think once engineers had established themselves as these solid members of a rising middle class, that also provided some of the freedom and the inclination to pursue these artist-engineer collaborations. And of course, a large part of that expansion of the cohort of engineers was due to the military needs of the Cold War, whether it was aerospace or microelectronics or new materials or computing technologies. All of these were growth areas in science and engineering that required more and more engineers to work on them. But I think there's also another factor which plays into that. Because the demand on the part of large companies like, General Electric or IBM or what have you, for engineers was so large, engineers had a lot of financial freedom relative to what they had experienced before or later on. So for engineers who were interested in collaborating with a musician or an artist, they could go to their manager or their supervisor and make this request. And because the manager or the supervisor wanted to keep those people in the company because they didn't want to have to keep retraining people, there was a motivation on the part of company executives to want to make their employees happy and to give them the freedom to work on these things. So Bell Laboratories is or was the research branch of AT&T. AT&T, of course, being responsible and having a monopoly on telecommunications in the United States during the 50s, 60s, and then into the 1970s. And Bell Laboratories was where the research wing of AT&T was. And Bell Labs was responsible for all sorts of inventions and improvements on them. I mean, whether it's the transistor or research into computing or lasers or what have you, Bell Laboratories was, arguably one of, if not the world's preeminent research laboratories funded by a corporation at this time. So experiments in art and technology, of course, was one of the main things that I was interested in. And then the other main initiative that I was interested in was the art and technology program that was started in the late 1960s at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And again, I was drawn to it because the archival records for it were fairly substantial, so there was a lot of things to work with. But also it was a very high-profile effort that brought in a lot of big-name artists and partnered these artists with a lot of major companies, many of them also connected to the defense establishment, which, as the art and technology program went on into the early 1970s, that became somewhat of a liability for it as the protests against the war in Southeast Asia and the collaboration of artists with companies that were tied to military work became less acceptable. I think of 1968 just specifically, it's the year of the Tet Offensive. It's the period of time where I think people in the United States are gradually beginning to realize that they're not being told the truth about what is happening in Vietnam. And it's around in 1970 that the public sentiment begins to shift against the war, especially on American college campuses, which then gets tied to specific things in the United States, like the upsurge of, drafting young men and sending them, into the military. So a whole host of different things kind of come together. But I think the other thing that kind of, separates the Los Angeles County Museum of Art effort from EAT is the Los Angeles project was very much about partnering artists with corporations. And the engineers, as has oftentimes been the case throughout history, were oftentimes still kept anonymous. They are maybe given a little bit of credit, or maybe their name appears somewhere, but it was always the artist being given priority, if you will, in the creative hierarchy, as opposed to the engineer. The thing that I think really distinguishes EAT is that Billy Klüver and the other people who ran EAT really worked to try to bring those two types of individuals to the same level. And I think one of the things that EAT tried to do, and it's debatable as to how successful it was, but I think it was to try to push this idea that being an engineer involves being creative. And in some ways, that creativity is similar to the kind of creativity that an artist engages with. Billy Klüver, when he started EAT, was very, very specific that it was about engineers and artists. I can't recall the exact quote. It's somewhere in my book, but he makes some comment to the idea of what would an artist and a scientist have to talk about? They would talk about truth or beauty or something, but for him, he wasn't interested in that. To him, that took it to like this, rarefied, abstract level, whereas he saw it, whether it was an artist, even someone who was doing conceptualist art or minimalist art or whatever, they were still making something. And I think he felt that engineers really had a place in that process. And again, that idea of process, not product, was one of the mantras, if you will, of EAT and many of these other artist-engineer collaborations. Was it really was about the process of getting these two different communities of creative people together and getting them to work together.